Now, my previous video ended as the armed demonstration initiated by the machine gun regiment was kicking off the July days of 1917. And Trotsky explains why the Bolsheviks, who had at first tried to counsel against the soldiers and the workers taking to the streets, had to change their tactics. Trotsky explains that the Petrograd workers and soldiers had to test the situation with their own experience, and their armed demonstration was such a test. But the test might, against the will of the masses, have turned into a general battle, and by the same token, into a decisive defeat. In such a situation, the party dared not stand aside. The party of the masses was compelled to stand on the same ground on which the masses stood, in order, while not in the least sharing their illusions, to help them make the necessary inferences with the least possible loss. Now, by the late evening of July the 3rd, regiments and entire factories were pouring, first to the Bolshevik headquarters at the Palace of Kushinskaya, and then marching on to the Tauride Palace, where the Soviet EC was based. As Trotsky puts it, both spiritually and physically, the movement revolved around these two antagonistic centres. It came to the house of Kushinskaya for instructions, for leadership, inspirational speeches. To the Tauride Palace, it came to present demands and even to threaten a little with its power. Now that afternoon, a Petrograd conference of the Bolsheviks had resolved once again to appeal to the machine gunners to hold back. It resolved that we must at all costs postpone the final conflict. The offensive at the front is holding the whole country at high tension. Its failure is inevitable, as is also the determination of the government to throw all responsibility for the defeat upon the Bolsheviks. We must give the compromisers time to ruin themselves completely. And the Bolshevik CC confirmed that decision and prepared an appeal to go out on the front page of Pravda the next morning. But when the machine gun regiment at the front of the demonstration first reached the Palace of Kushinskaya, the appeals from the Bolshevik speakers on the balcony were shouted down, with cries of "Down with it, Doloi, Doloi." Trotsky notes such cries the Bolshevik balcony had never yet heard from the soldiers. It was an alarming sign. Behind the regiments, the factories began to march up. All power to the Soviets, down with the 10 minister capitalists. Now these had been the banners of June the 18th, but now they were hedged with bayonets. The demonstration had become a mighty fact. What was to be done? Now the mood of the Petrograd workers and soldiers was only too clear. It was no use in carrying on trying to hold them back any longer. But neither could the Bolsheviks just stand aside and allow a semi-insurrection to develop, which could all too easily be led by an assortment of anarchists and adventurers into a bloody disaster. The Petrograd Committee, along with the delegates to the conference and representatives from regiments and factories, met and agreed to change course. With the endorsement of the Central Committee, the CC, the Bolsheviks agreed to end all fruitless attempts to restrain the masses and guide the developing movement in such a way that the governmental crisis may be decided in the interests of the people, with this goal to appeal to the soldiers and workers to go peacefully to the Tauride Palace, elect delegates, and through them present their demands to the Soviet Executive Committee. To the relief of the machine gunners, and no doubt many rank-and-file Bolsheviks, the movement had now been endorsed by the party. And by coincidence, the workers' section of the Soviet was to meet at last that very evening in the Tauride Palace. The compromisers had been trying to postpone the meeting for some time, but had now agreed to convene it, because they feared that the results of the various by-elections in the factories might mean that the composition of the Soviet was catching up with the real support of the parties in the city. In other words, that the Bolsheviks might now have gained a majority, and so it proved. Putting their new policy into effect, Kamenev proposed that the meeting elect a commission of 25 to lead the movement. Trotsky seconded the proposal. Realising they were going to lose the vote, the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries just walked out of the hall. And actually from now on, this would be a favourite tactic of the supposed Democrats. When they started to lose a majority, they simply opted to boycott those Soviets. So the motion was passed in their absence with 276 votes, and 15 Bolsheviks were elected to the commission. 10 places were left for the absent minority, but they never took them. News of the victory was given rapturous applause by the crowds now massing at the palace. Trotsky explains, the fact of the election of the Bolshevik Commission signified both to friends and enemies that the workers' section of the Petrograd Soviet would henceforth become a Bolshevik base. A vast step forward. In April, the influence of the Bolsheviks has extended to approximately a third of the Petrograd workers. In the Soviet of those days, they occupied a wholly insignificant sector. Now, at the beginning of July, the Bolsheviks were sending to the workers' section about 2/3 of its members. That meant that amongst the masses, their influence had become decisive. Now, meanwhile, the compromisers had also decided on a course of action, but one that rapidly exposed who really had the power in Petrograd. They decided to waste no time in seeking out armed forces to defend the government and to try and crush the movement. Orders signed by the Menshevik president of the EC, Shidze, were sent to every regiment to come to the defence of the Tauride Palace. However, the soldiers of Petrograd took little notice. As the Menshevik, given the unenviable task of gathering troops, later reported, on the first day of the demonstration, we had at our disposal only 100 men. We had no other forces. We sent out commissars to all the regiments, but each regiment looked to the next to see what it was going to do. We were compelled to summon troops from the front. As Trotsky adds, it would be difficult, even with malice aforethought, to devise a more vicious satire upon the compromisers. Hundreds of thousands of demonstrators were demanding the transfer of power to the Soviets. Shidze, standing at the head of the Soviet system, and thus the logical candidate for premier, was hunting for armed forces to employ against the demonstrators. This colossal movement in favour of power to the democracy was denounced by the democratic leaders as an attack upon the democracy by an armed gang. By now, the demonstrators surrounded the Tauride Palace on all sides. Izvestia, the official paper of the Soviet, describes how the troops elected a deputation to the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, which presented in their name the following demands: removal of the 10 bourgeois ministers, all power to the Soviets, cessation of the offensive, confiscation of the printing plants of the bourgeois press, the land to be state property, state control of production. The deputation demanded to speak to the worker, soldiers and peasants' executive committees, then meeting in joint session. But, far from being welcomed, as perhaps many of them had expected, they were, of course, met with hostility. To the machine gunners' amazement, Tseretelli denounced the demonstrators for taking the road of counter-revolution, not revolution. The meeting dragged on until 5 a.m, as the compromisers decided to play for time, and most of all, the arrival of reliable troops. Already elsewhere in the city, the first serious conflicts had broken out. The route of the march to the Tauride Palace took it along the Nevsky Prospect, the main thoroughfare through some of the most affluent parts of the city. The middle classes, students and officers had shouted their opposition to the marches. Fights had taken place, even shots fired into the air. Then, around midnight, as the Grenadier Regiment was on the Nevsky, they were shot at for several minutes from someone and somewhere unknown. In the panic, workers fled, while soldiers lay down under fire, as they had been taught to in military training. But the first casualties of those July days never got up again. These clashes were just one part of the balance sheet that now had to be drawn up to decide the strategy for the next day. A night session of the Bolsheviks, together with Trotsky's inter-district Mezhraoncy group, met in the Tauride Palace. Reports from the districts made clear that the July 3rd demonstration was just the start. Since the Soviet leaders had made no decision to take the power, it seemed obvious to the masses that the only course of action was to increase the pressure on them. The factories and regiments were preparing to march in even greater numbers. The garrison of the Kronstadt fortress was also setting out for Petrograd that morning. There was clearly no possibility of pulling back the marches now. The summons of the Central Committee to stop the demonstration that had been agreed that afternoon was pulled from the presses, leaving a blank page in the July the 4th Pravda as evidence of the rapid changes that had taken place. Instead, a Bolshevik leaflet was issued, summoning the workers and soldiers by way of a peaceful and organised demonstration to bring their will to the attention of the Executive Committee now in session. The practical organisation of the movement now fell to the Petrograd Committee of the Bolsheviks. Nevsky, Podvoisky and other members of the military organisation were given the task of mobilising the garrison. Appeals and instructions were issued, armoured cars sent to key bridges and junctions, ready to protect the marchers. The demonstration started to assemble towards midday on the 4th. The soldiers were again out in force, not least the 1st Machine Gun Regiment, who were there to the last man. But unlike the previous day's demonstration, which had been led by the soldiers, the factory workers had now come out in greatest force. Workplaces that had not come out on the 3rd were now there on the 4th, including factories previously considered strongholds of the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries. Trotsky explains that all the factories struck and held meetings. They elected leaders for the demonstration and delegates to present their demands to the Executive Committee. Again, hundreds of thousands moved in radii towards the Tauride Palace, and again tens of thousands turned aside on their way there to the palace of Keshinskaya. Today's movement was more impressive and organised than yesterday's. The guiding hand of the party was evident. But the feeling too was hotter today. The soldiers and workers were out for a solution to the crisis. So, while the EC searched for troops to put down the movement, soldiers and sailors from all the bases around Petrograd were arriving by land and sea to join the demonstration. The high point of the day was when about 10,000 armed sailors, soldiers and workers from Kronstadt arrived on tugs and steamers around midday. With bands playing, rifles over their shoulders and banners flying, the Kronstadt men marched to join the demonstration at the palace of Keshinskaya. Sverdlov, Lunacharsky and other Bolsheviks, speaking from the balcony, were this time stormily applauded. But that was nothing compared to the joyous outburst from the Kronstadt men that greeted the appearance of Lenin. He had arrived there from his temporary refuge in Finland. Trotsky says his speech consisted of a few simple phrases: a greeting to the demonstrators, an expression of confidence that the slogan "All power to the Soviets" would conquer in the end, an appeal for firmness and self-restraint. The crowd marched away, this time with the colossal banner of the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks at the head of the march, much to the disgust of the left social revolutionary leaders from Kronstadt. With their demands for the banner to be removed refused, they childishly announced they would leave the demo. But none of the soldiers and sailors followed their leaders. The holiday mood of the march was, however, soon to change. The Petrograd military commanders had been unable to gather together more than a few small detachments of Cossacks and Junkers, the students at the officers' schools. Trotsky says they were powerless to put down the movement, but adequate for purposes of provocation. Since almost the whole garrison was against them, or at best neutral, it was the official government that had to rely on small bands and individual snipers to ambush the march, to spread panic and confusion, and to provoke clashes with the armed demonstrators. In a good number of encounters on that day, they succeeded. For example, Raskolnikov, leader of the Bolsheviks in Kronstadt, reported how the march was fired upon from a hidden position. In the resulting confusion, soldiers were shooting in all directions. Several were killed and wounded. Podvoisky reported similar provocation and panic as the soldiers passed along the Nevsky, and that's been photographed. Other similar skirmishes developed, but the worst encounter took place around 8 p.m, when the demonstration was in full swing. 2 Cossack squadrons rode up as a guard for the Tauride Palace, refusing to enter into conversation with the demonstrators, in itself a bad sign. They rode up towards a barricade erected near the Litani Bridge, and soon after, perhaps provoked by shots from reactionary officers hiding in nearby houses, the fight broke out. The Cossacks and marchers exchanged heavy fire, enough to force the Cossacks to retreat, but they ran into another section of armed workers and were forced to flee, leaving horses and weapons behind them. 7 Cossacks and 6 demonstrators were killed, about 20 on each side wounded. Overall, an estimated 29 were killed over the July days and 114 wounded, again in roughly equal numbers on each side. So when the demonstration, now over 500,000 strong, arrived to besiege the Tauride Palace, there was now an angry and tense mood. The leading social revolutionary minister, Chernov, was brought out to address the Kronstadt men. Sensing the mood, he spoke briefly, directing his fire at the cadets. But Milyukov even relates how a husky worker, shaking his fist at the face of the minister, shouted furiously, "Take the power, you son of a bitch, when they give it to you." Even though nothing more than an anecdote, this expresses with crude accuracy the essence of the July situation. Milyukov knew that the compromisers did not want to take the power. Trotsky goes on that after the Cossack squadrons, who were the sole obstacle on the road to the Tauride Palace, had been swept away, it seemed to many demonstrators the victory was assured. In reality, the chief obstacle was sitting in the very palace itself. Now, it was agreed that a delegation from the demonstrators could address the joint session of the Executive Committee, beginning at 6 p.m. that evening. The orators protested against being described as counter-revolutionists and again outlined their demands. "We have confidence in the Soviet, but not in those whom the Soviet has confidence. At this time, when the cadets have refused to work with you, we ask you with whom further you want to dicker. We demand that the power pass to the Soviets." The propaganda slogans of the manifestation of June the 18th had now become an armed ultimatum of the masses. The Soviet leaders, of course, would have nothing of it, and frustrated and angry, the mood of the crowd was turning nasty. A typically powerful speech from Zinoviev played a key role in encouraging the marchers to disperse. Trotsky relates that while having his political weaknesses, Under the walls of the Tauride palace in the July days, Zinoviev was extraordinarily active, ingenious and strong. He raised the excitement of the masses to its highest note, not in order to summon them to decisive action, but on the contrary, in order to restrain them. This corresponded to the moment and to the policy of the party. Zinoviev was wholly in his element. Now, Trotsky relates how isolated fights and disturbances continued throughout the nights of July the 4th and 5th. Skirmishes, victims, fruitlessness of the struggle, and indefiniteness of practical aim. That describes the movement, says Trotsky. The Central Committee of the Bolsheviks passed a resolution to call on the workers and soldiers to end the demonstration. This time, that appeal, which was immediately brought to the attention of the Executive Committee, met hardly any opposition at all in the lower ranks. The masses ebbed back into the suburbs, and they cherished no intention of renewing the struggle on the following day. They felt that the problem of power to the Soviets was considerably more complicated than it appeared. Now, meanwhile, in the Tauride Palace, the workers and soldiers delegates were still sitting and waiting for an answer to their demands from the Soviet Executive Committee. The compromisers kept spinning out the EC meeting with long and pointless speeches. Then suddenly, around 4 a.m., the moment they had been waiting for arrived. Marching into the building, behind a band playing the Marseillaise, the EC's long-awaited, reliable troops were finally at hand. Their commander, a Menshevik lieutenant, stepped onto the tribune while the triumphant EC leaders embraced and sang. A classic picture of the beginning of a counter-revolution, muttered the left Menshevik Martov, accurately enough. Now, these troops had not marched to Petrograd from the front. They had been finally gathered together from some of the most politically backward battalions in the capital, who up to then had obstinately remained neutral. Trotsky says that only in the afternoon of July the 4th did the authorities at last discover an effective way of influencing them. They showed the Preobrazhentsy documents demonstrating as plain as 2 + 2 = 4 that Lenin was a German spy. That moved them. The news flew round the regiments. Officers, members of the regimental committee, agitators of the EC were active everywhere. The mood of the neutral battalions changed. But now the counter-revolution felt its strength to go on its own offensive. Troops were sent to arrest workers' leaders. The story was spread far and wide that all Bolsheviks were German spies. Of course, while saying they didn't want the power, the Soviet leaders were in fact having to take control of the deployment of the Petrograd garrison. Trotsky puts it wryly, in order to offer armed resistance to those who had written on their banners, "All power to the Soviets," the Soviet was obliged actually to concentrate the power in its hands. At 6 a.m. on the 5th of July, Junkers and soldiers arrived at the offices of Pravda and tore it apart. Sentries and office employees were beaten up and arrested. The presses at the printing plant, paid for through 3 months of workers' hard-earned donations, were smashed to pieces. Urgent preparation was made to protect the Bolshevik headquarters in the house of Keshinskaya. Now the EC leaders, still waiting for troops from the front, pretended to the Bolshevik leaders that they had nothing to fear. An agreement was reached where the Bolsheviks would persuade the sailors to return to Kronstadt and ensure that all armoured cars and patrols were removed. The government, in turn, promised to oppose any repression and to free those arrested. But, bolstered by news that reliable troops were arriving from the front and that more detachments in the city were also rediscovering their loyalty to the government, they soon forgot about their agreement. On the 6th, the workers went back to work. More and more regiments were arriving from the front in aggressive mood. Some were deliberately shot at by provocateurs. Trotsky notes that it was clear that experienced provocateurs were greeting the soldiers with lead, with a view to anti-Bolshevik inoculation. The workers were eager to explain this to the arriving soldiers, but they were denied access to them. For the first time since the February days, the Junker or the officer stood between the worker and the soldier, explains Trotsky. At 3 a.m. on July the 7th, the government finally moved troops against the palace of Kshetinskaya. But they soon found out that the Bolsheviks had largely evacuated the building already. Those Kronstadters who had not yet got away to their base had sought refuge in the Peter and Paul fortress. By negotiation, these remaining soldiers surrendered their weapons and returned to Kronstadt. The July days were over.